Hello, I'm Marilyn Allis. People aren't as scary as you think. Once you've put figures into your paintings, you won't be able to stop. Don't make it difficult. People are just blobs of light and dark shapes. With just a few simple brush marks, you can create a crowd of recognisable people. Let me show you each stage of the painting step by step so you can create a vibrant, colourful painting. This morning I was in the local market. Markets are a great place to go. There's so much that you can gather to use in a painting. There are lovely shapes, lovely colours, interesting people. You can find so much material there to use. I've just concentrated on a couple that were walking through the street. They look quite interesting, and I'm not going to paint in the background. I'm just going to show you how easy it is to paint figures. I've drawn them, but not in any detail. I'm just looking for the light and dark shapes. So I'll mix up washes to start with, very, very pale, so they're almost like a watermark. The first one's going to be raw sienna and a little bit of alizarin crimson because I want these to go in quickly. Just using a size 16 brush. You can see there's hardly any colour showing at all. It's really just like a watermark. And now the alizarin crimson for the top. I'm just putting that all over the t-shirt to start with. Now whilst that's slightly damp, I'm going to add in a thicker mix of the alizarin crimson. And this will just blend slightly. And now I'm going to use some intense violet. Now the colours are running, but that's helpful, that adds to movement. That's all I'm going to do at the moment. Later on I'll put some dry brush marks in. The next stage is to put the washes on for the skin tones, which are just light red with a tiny bit of sepia in it. And whilst that's still damp, because the light's hitting part of her arm, I'm taking out the colour on the brush, so there's just clear water and just running that down where I want the light to hit it. It's as easy as that. This arm's more in shadow. I'm just putting them on very, very quickly. You don't have to fuss or fiddle. Now, whilst that's still damp, I'll just mix a little bit of sepia and light red so it's much, much thicker. So a lot more pigment and a lot less water. And that's just the shape that the dark's making on that side. And there's a little bit of dark here. The hair is blonde, so I'll just use a little bit of raw sienna. We can use the wash that we made up before for the trousers. It's amazing how dark the shadows are on blonde hair, so with some sepia just on its own. And that's just bleeding in slightly. The man that's standing next to her, he's sort of completely in browns and beiges. I'm going to give him a blue top, so I'm using a wash of ultramarine. Again, well watered down, so it's just like a watermark. And his shorts can be a Prussian blue. And again, this is well watered down, lots of water and very little pigment. And For the darker areas, I'm just going to add a little bit of sepia to the Prussian blue and just put that in now whilst it's damp. And with his top, I use the ultramarine, much thicker, and a little bit of burnt umber. And now for his skin, again the mixture of light red mixed with sepia. Where the sunlight's hitting it, take the colour off the brush and just take that off of the paper. And for the soles of his shoes, I just use some intense violet. His hair's quite dark, so that can just be sepia on its own. I'll put in the handbag now. To make it three-dimensional, you've got the light hitting one side, and then put in just a thick mix of alizarin crimson and some intense violet. Now the base is dry, I'm just going to finish with a few dry brush marks which will just make the figures look 3D. If you're not sure where the dark shapes are, you can just squint and see the shapes that they're making. And do the same for the man. I'll use ultramarine, very thick, and some burnt umber. And just to finish off completely, I'll use a shadow of intense violet. So with a larger brush, and that just anchors the figures to the ground. And it's as easy as that. The really important thing when you're painting figures is not to get bogged down in the detail. Just look for the light and dark shapes and put those into your paintings. When I'm out and about looking for different people to paint, there are so many combinations that you can use. This chap just had such an appeal. Now we're going to put in a face without any detail, which you might find strange, but it actually works. And we've got a dog as well, which we're going to simplify right down, so nothing to be frightened about. I'm going to start with the face mix of light red and sepia, using the size 16 brush. I'll just put that on quickly. What I've looked for are the light and dark shapes that the sunlight is making on it. I can darken that slightly more. You'll be amazed at what you think is a white face, how dark those tones go. And he's got grey hair, so we can use a mix of cobalt blue with light red. And just follow that shadow up. Just a little bit of his collar underneath that's in shadow. Now he's wearing very dark clothes, so a good mix for darks is a Prussian blue mixed with a sepia. See how lovely and dark that is. I'll just leave a little white gap here so that we can see his arm coming out. And there's another dark bit on the sleeve, and we can leave a white gap there too so that you can break up his arms. I'm taking some of that paint off, so I'm left with something, just water and a little bit of colour, and I'm just going to drag that down for where the light's hitting that side of him. Already he looks three-dimensional with just a few really simple brush marks. I'm going to use Intense Violet and Sepia just to break up the colours, because he does look as if he's wearing all the same colour, which could look a little bit boring. And these are the dark bits. Just looking at the shapes that they're making. Take off that colour, just run the brush down the side. The sun is really helping us on this, giving us the very light shapes and the very dark shapes. He's carrying a bag, so we use some raw sienna. It looks like a Hessian type bag. Again, very watered down where the light's hitting it. A touch of sepia where it's in shade. And the walking stick can be the same colour. What I've tried to do with this composition is the dog's very low, the man is much taller, and I've got a walking stick that's going backwards, and it just adds a lot of interest. If you caught the shot sort of 2 seconds earlier, the walking stick would be across the front of him and it just wouldn't look so good or have so much impact. Now the dog is just a few brush marks. We don't want to make it complicated, so I'm using burnt umber. I'm just putting anything that looks as if it's burnt umber, the legs. And then down through the middle, he's got a darker patch, which we can use the Prussian blue and the sepia that we've already mixed. And there we have a dog with just a few blobs. I'll put some shoes in and we're almost done. I try not to put too much detail into the shoes, but to leave a lot to your imagination. Then if you get them wrong, it doesn't look so bad. I just need a lead to the dog. Just use the very point on your brush. You can still keep with the same brush. There's a fantastic point on there. Light red and sepia for the hands, and we use the mix of Intense Violet and sepia for the shadow. With just a few simple marks, you've got a composition of a man with a dog that is really recognisable, but very, very simplified. I thought it would be nice to have a different subject matter. This lady's pushing her bike along the river. Bikes can be really scary, but they're not. You've just got to simplify it right down. You don't have to paint every spoke. I'm just going to put in the skin tones first, and I'm going to keep this very, very simple. So light red and sepia with your size 16 brush. The skin is very dark because it was silhouetted against the sun. You're probably thinking that that doesn't look like it should be because skin is white, but it is literally that colour. If you're not sure when something's silhouetted, just put a piece of white paper up against your reference material and you'll be amazed at how dark that is. On the photograph you can see that there's a man walking along with her. It didn't work out for using them both in the composition because of how he's walking, and it just looked a little bit strange, so I've decided just to use the girl. I'm just keeping the handlebars light and painting underneath part of her t-shirt. It's really difficult to see where her legs are going, and if you can't see, then just put in the blobs that you can and the shapes that you see. And I'm going to use Prussian blue and sepia. You can see a triangle here, so that can go in. There's a shape coming down here. And there's something going on behind here. You don't have to worry about all the detail. You can make out a foot, and there's a part of a foot here. We'll put in her hair, which again I just use sepia on its own. I'm just putting in the dark shapes. That's probably all we need for her. Now the bicycle could look really, really complicated, and I'm just going to put in some marks. So we use the mix of Prussian blue and sepia. And I'm not taking the wheels right round to the ground. I'm going to lose part of it into the shadow, because if you don't get them exactly the right shape, your eye will go straight to them. There's a few lighter bits which we can use cobalt blue with a tiny bit of light red. I don't think we probably need much more than that. Just put the handlebars in. And she's got a bag or something that she's holding. And I'll do that in a raw sienna, just so that it's different. Perhaps it's not a bag, perhaps it's a coat, but we're just putting in the shape that it makes. We're not worrying about it. And now I'm going to do the shadow, which I use the light red and the cobalt blue to make. And I'm pulling that into the wheel so it goes over it, so that if you haven't got that wheel round, it doesn't matter. So there we are, that's the bike painted really quickly with no hassle and hardly any detail. Crime scenes can really be terrifying, but they needn't be. They are so simple to do, and they create such an atmosphere if you do include them. First of all, I'm going to paint in the figure in the front, which will sort of define what's going on in the background. I'm going to use some alizarin crimson, well watered down, for this lady's trousers where the light's just hitting it. She's quite silhouetted, so nice and easy to paint in. Add some intense violet for the shadow areas. I'm just getting nice dry brush marks to create movements along the edges. She's got a yellow shirt on. I'm going to use cadmium yellow and a little bit of Prussian blue mixed in with that, because again it is in shadow. I'm using the wash brush, which really helps you to put the paint on quickly, but it has a fantastic point for any detail. And now we're going to do the skin tones, which are the light red and sepia. Just carrying a bag, but we don't really need that, so we'll miss that off. Just around some clear water where the light's hitting her arm. There's just a tiny bit on there. And some sepia for her hair. And intense violet for her trainers. Well, that's the lady established in the foreground. Now you're seeing lots and lots of people in the background, and you could think, oh my goodness, I just can't do those. We're just going to look at heads and bodies and paint them really quickly. We're painting them in ultramarines and burnt umbers, just to sort of push it back into the distance, and more watered down than the person that we've done at the front, so a little bit more water added. So that's ultramarine I'm mixing with some burnt umber, and you just paint in the figures that you can see, just very quickly. Now we can use some ultramarine on its own. See, we're not fussing, we're not looking at detail, that's just going in very, very quickly. A little bit of alizarin crimson, well watered down. And we can use some intense violet watered down as well. Already you can see that scene sort of emerging. We just need to put in a little bit of skin tone, so some light red blobs for faces, arms and legs, just very quickly. And some sepia for hair, just little dots of it dotted around. Some more people in the background behind these. We need a little bit of shadow, so we can use some intense violet. And really just pulling the shadow off of their feet. Mix with a little bit of intense violet for the shadow in the foreground. A few more people behind. See how easy it is to create a crowd of people that you can recognise as people in the distance, but just painted in seconds. We've been painting and practising lots of figures in various positions, so now it's time to put them into context. And the market scene was really vibrant and colourful, and I'm going to simplify it right down. When you look at the picture, you can see so much detail with the flowers and everything. Don't be scared, we're going to simplify it down. I'm going to start using my whopper brush and a wash of raw sienna to add some sunlight to the painting, because it was a very hot sunny morning. I want it very watered down. I want it just to be a hint of colour. Anywhere that's dark, you can take the wash straight over, but the bits that you want to keep light, you'll need to use the point of the whopper brush just to paint around it. The building in the background, you can see from the photograph, does look very beige, and we could do that in raw sienna, but what I'm going to do is to put a wash of cobalt blue with a tiny bit of light red in it, because I want to push that into the distance, and I don't want it to be fussy or dark. You can see a lot of architecture on it, but with the fussiness of the foreground, we want to really simplify that background. I'm using a rough ash paper, and I always use a rough paper because that really helps me to create movement, because you have bumps on the paper and the brush rubs over those and it creates rough lines which really add to movement. Now once this wash is wet, I'm mixing some ultramarine with some burnt umber. And it's got to be slightly thicker than what you've put on, otherwise you'll get cauliflowers. And I'm just indicating that doorway in the background. I want you to be aware of where it is, but I don't want to have a lot of fuss and busyness going on. And that will dry quite a lot lighter. Before you do anything else, we've got to get that wash completely dry. We don't want the figures to run into it. Right, next we're going to include the figures. They're the main focal points, so they need to go in next before I do anything else, then I can work around them. I'll start with a skin tone of light red and just a hint of sepia. Now the faces are forward, but you've got no detail. If you start putting eyes and noses in, you'll actually just kill them. I'm taking off some of the paint and just making it lighter where the sun is hitting her. The arms I'm doing slightly darker so that they show up. Now she's got a green top on. I'm going to make that much brighter as she is the focal point, so we're going to do that in lemon yellow. You can see from the photograph that I've actually placed the figures slightly closer together in the drawing. That just makes them look more interesting. I'll just add a little bit of Prussian blue for where there are shadows. That's all we need at the moment. We can put in some dry brush marks a little bit later. And her skirt, I'm going to use an ultramarine again rather than that beigey colour. We'll let that dry and then we can put in dry brush marks a little bit later. Her hair I can do in a raw sienna. And just a touch of sepia where the shadows are, just underneath. She's carrying a handbag. I just mix a little bit of Prussian blue and sepia. Just slightly darkened so that it shows up, and she's got a carrier bag as well. So I'll just use a little bit of intense violet for the shadows on it. Right, onto the man. Now he's got a hat on. We can use raw sienna again, and because we've changed the colour of the background, that will look fine. On the photograph, as you can see, it actually blends in to the background. The mix of light red and sepia for the skin tones. A little bit of shadow there, shadow here. I'll just wash out that colour and bring that down. You can see the brush picking up on the bumps on the paper, which creates some movement. His clothes are sort of quite bland as well. I think we could use an alizarin crimson and just brighten him up a little bit. And some intense violet for the shadows on his shirt. And I use that intense violet for his trousers as well, so I'll put a wash just over the whole of them. And then just add in where it's a medium tone, where his leg's bending, that's slightly darker. And we need to just let that dry, and then we can put in the dry brush marks and the very dark tones later. Just a little bit of sepia for his shoes. I'll just put this lady's shoes on. Keeping it very, very simple. I need to let that dry, so whilst that's drying I can paint the flowers. Now they can look really complicated because you've got lots and lots of colour and lots of stems and pots and everything. What I'm going to do is just wet the paper and just drip in very, very thick, neat colours. Now you're probably saying, what's happening? But don't worry. I can add some orange, cadmium orange. A little bit of intense violet. And we're using very, very concentrated paint. We've wet the background and there's very little water going into this because it will dry a lot lighter than you think. And we can add a little bit of cadmium yellow as well. Now, Prussian blue and sepia make good greens with a tiny bit of cadmium yellow. And for those dark sort of stem bits, I can just put a few of those in now. Now we just leave that side and go on to the other side. And in the same way, just wet the background first where the flowers are. Go in with your alizarin crimson. Some cadmium yellow. And some intense violet. And again, just a few of the greens. We've got to let that dry now. Right, now I'm going to put in the shadow areas on the awnings. I'm just going to use an intense violet, a medium wash, and just swash straight over the areas that are white but in shadow. In fact, we can wash over all of that and then paint the red over the top, which will give us a nice shadow. And we can do that the same the other side. There's a little bit of light hitting there, so miss that bit off. Right, now the people look a little bit undefined at the moment. I'm just going to put in dry brush marks of the dark tones that I can see. If you're not sure, just squint at them until they become more obvious. I'm using Prussian blue and lemon yellow. And just dark lines around some of her clothes. A few creases, just dry brush marks going across. And then using a Prussian blue and sepia for the marks in the skirt, which will give you a lot of movement as well. A little bit of sepia for a dark mark or shadow on her leg. Already she's standing out a little bit more, and I just look for any dark shadows that are on her arms. So again, using the sepia, more sepia and a little bit of red, light red, quite thick. There's a shadow there. Dark shadow underneath that arm. There's a dark one under her chin and that side of her face. We do the same with intense violet on her carrier bag. A few dry brush marks, and she stands out a lot more. Just those, you don't want to overdo it, but just see what's there. Now we do the same with the man. So we use sepia for the shadows under his hat, and there's a lovely shadow down this side. Shadow on that side of the face. It's coming down. And with the alizarin crimson mixed with some intense violet, shadows down that side of him. There's a shadow there too. A few dry brush marks. A shadow there. And then the same on the trousers. It's quite a strong one coming down here, which would be really useful to us. Dry brush mark. Nice strong one on that leg. A few creases here. I just look for any shadows on his arms. There are a few. So using the light red and the sepia, just underneath that sleeve. And again, he stands out. Now they're not sort of buried into the background. Now that's dry, I'm going to continue by painting the dark shadows on the awnings and the colour on the awnings. So first of all, using alizarin crimson. Just using the SAA all-rounder. There are stripes on the awning, but I'm keeping this really simple and just painting them in red. And then over the top of that mauve, so this is all in shadow down this side. A little bit on the end, and then onto the other side, a little bit of red there. And this is helping you to place where you're going as well with your painting. Alright, the next stage I use a larger brush. I use the size 16, and I'm going to make some shadows out of intense violet and alizarin crimson. Very dark. I want the contrast to be that dark. That's underneath the awning. I can go even darker than that. So lots of pigment and very little water. Just take that down a little bit. There's a bit of light coming through from an awning where the light's hitting it. I'll just go on to the other side and do the same. Another red one to go, and I just paint that in because you do need to see where you're going with it. That's slightly lighter, it's more in the distance, so a little bit more water. And then we continue with the dark shadows. If you can't see what's going on in the background, don't worry, just fill it in with the tones that you can see. Pearl wash over this area that's white but in shadow. It's very well watered down. Just slightly lighter. And I'm going to do the pots that are down this side of the painting, so they can be a Prussian blue and a little bit of sepia. Just the rim of one there. We don't have to paint it all in. It just gives sort of indications of what's happening here. Take out some of the paint. It's quite shiny and the light's really hitting it in the middle. We've got some raw sienna ones as well. Right, we'll just let that dry. I'm just going to continue with the shadows. Now that that's dry, we've got a shadow here. And I need to paint in some flower stems, so I'm going to use the all-rounder brush and the mix of Prussian blue sepia with a little bit of lemon. Some little dark areas underneath some of the flowers. Just a few marks, you don't want to do too many. I'm looking for the negative shapes that they're making. There's a dark patch here that we've left, so we'll just fill that in. Try not to leave too many white bits. And again, just down here. That's probably all we need to do to those flowers. We'll just do the same the other side. Just making out the dark shapes that you can see. Now, to the right of the man, I think there's some bits of carpet or something hanging up. We just fill those in with little bits of colour. So some intense violet, some raw sienna. Just keeping it very, very loose so that we haven't got too many hard lines there. And a little bit of alizarin crimson. And that just fills in that space. Right, they've got a shadow underneath them, so I use the larger brush, the size 16. I'm just going to mix some ultramarine, a little bit of burnt umber, and just anchor the people down to the ground. There's some shadows coming off of the flowers. Shadows off of these two people, and suddenly they're not floating. I know where they should be. With a smaller brush, we can just indicate a little bit of the brickwork in the background, but we'll do that in the mix of ultramarine and the burnt umber. So hardly any definition, just indications of what's going on behind there. I just need now to put on the white poles that are holding up the awning. So with just a card or a credit card, rub some white gouache along it. And just run that down your painting. Put it on quite thick. That gives you a lovely straight line. It's much easier than a brush. And it also picks up on the bumps in the paper. And we can do that the other side. And I think we're done. Now, as you can see, we've got lots of complicated things going on in the painting, but we've simplified it right down. There's lots of colour, there are shapes that you recognise easily, and you know that they're flowers by the bright colours, and just a few negative shapes that you've drawn in, and you've created that atmosphere of a really hot day in a market. That I'm going to paint next, I just couldn't resist. The combination of all the different couples and the interaction between them was just irresistible. But 15 minutes earlier, all those tables and chairs had been empty, and the composition, no, it was boring, there wouldn't be anything to do, but suddenly it filled up and it was alive. So we're going to capture that moment. Now with the Whopper brush, I'm going to mix up a wash of raw sienna and just put over all the bits where the sunlight is hitting it. So that's on the foreground on the pavement, and also the pillars and some of the building behind. It's a very, very light wash. So it will almost disappear as it dries. I'm also putting it here, although it's actually blue in the photograph, all the figures are slightly on the blue or mauve side, and I want them to stand out a little bit. I can add a little bit of raw sienna to this pillar, just into one side, whilst that's still wet, and that will just bleed in, just into the edge of the building there. Looking for all the light bits at the moment. You can paint straight over anything that is obviously dark, because that won't matter once it's dry. And now for the pavement. The drawing I've done in quite a lot of detail, but it's again a very tonal drawing. I've looked for the light and dark shapes that the sun is making on the people, and not a lot of detail. They are going to be very, very simple to put in. And I need to let that dry before I can do anything else to the painting. Right, now the background's dry, I can include all those lovely figures. I'm going to work my way through one at a time, not to complicate it too much. So using an SAA all-rounder, I'm going to mix up plenty of flesh tone, light red and sepia. It's quite a thick mixture because most of them are quite shaded. Just put in the darker shadow bits. Just doing it really quickly, don't fuss. Very dark bit just behind. And that arm's very dark. Now wash out that colour from the brush so you've got just clear water on there. And then just pull out the colour that you've already put on for where the sunlight is hitting those faces and arms. That guy's got on a white t-shirt. White is easy, just a little bit of intense violet on the shadow area. It's quite dark there in the shadow bit. And then just wash off some of it, and it's slightly lighter on this side. And his shorts are a mixture of intense violet and a little bit of sepia. darker underneath. And then wash that out slightly where the light's hitting it on the top. We'll use a little bit of burnt umber for his hair. And then add a little bit of sepia to darken that on the edges. And now just the shoes, the trainers, a little bit of the intense violet. Don't fuss too much with them, just a few little lines. And just to finish him, some cadmium red for the coffee. And now on to the next figure. So again, starting with the flesh tones of the light red and the sepia, put in the darker bits. Just try to work out where her foot is. Right, now we can add the hair whilst that's still wet. There's not so many lighter tones on this lady, just a few down here. And now some raw sienna for her hair. If that runs, that's quite nice. I'm going to use, I think, a yellow, a lemon yellow for her t-shirt. And just keep it quite pale because she's going to have a dark background behind her. And if I do it in the mauve, that will disappear completely into it. So just some lemon yellow. And we use ultramarine mixed with burnt umber for the shadow colours on her trousers. That's a nice triangle there, another triangle here, and some shadow around that side. Already she's looking three-dimensional. A few dry brush marks here, and a little bit of shadow there. And that's our second person completed. We go on to the third, an elderly gentleman. Again, the flesh tones of the light red mixed with the sepia. Not a lot of detail in the hands, they're just sort of placed where they are. Some Prussian blue and sepia for his suit. I'm making this more watered down because there's not a lot of shadow on it. It looks lighter where the sun's hitting him. We can put the darker bits in a minute. And a little bit of grey hair, which can be cobalt blue with light red. And a mixture of sepia and Prussian blue, but more on the brown side for his shoes. And whilst that's drying, we can go on to the other two and then go back to the dry brush marks on his clothes. This lady again, I think, can have a lemon yellow shirt. And she can have Prussian blue and sepia trousers. Slightly more Prussian blue so she doesn't look exactly the same as the gentleman next to her. Well, that can be a lot darker behind, just to push it backwards. There's a little bit of dark there, and the rest we will put in later. And her shoes are almost the same colour as the pavement, so we'll just alter that slightly by making them burnt umber. And not a lot of detail, but you can see exactly what they are. And raw sienna for her hair, because again the background is going to be very dark later. A little bit of sepia underneath the hairline. And then the skin tones. There's not very much showing on her, just a tiny little bit on the face. That's the light red sepia and the hand. And again, we'll put the dry brush marks in once that's dry. So on to the last person. Dry brush marks for the legs. And his shirt can be a mixture of intense violet and sepia. Just wash right over it for the moment. I need to darken his shorts. We'll make those sepia because the background is quite light. And we're just thinking what's behind and just altering things slightly. And his hair needs to be light too, because of the dark background, so that can be some raw sienna. And touches of sepia where the shadows are. Right, go back to the elderly gentleman, still using the all-rounder brush, and we'll mix up some Prussian blue and sepia, very thick with not a lot of water. And we just need to get in some of those very dark areas. There's a dark shape here, shadow from the table, this bit's darker. Look at the shapes that it's making. Dark bit of shadow there. There's a crease. Not so much at the top because more light's hitting him there. And he's done. Now on to the lady. Just some Prussian blue mixed with that lemon yellow for her darker shapes. A little bit of dark there. Dark underneath the arm. It's amazing once you put these bits in how they suddenly look 3D. A few dry brush marks, and she's finished. And now on to the last person. So with the intense violet mixed with the sepia. Dark shadows under his sleeve. Shadow coming down here, some folds in the fabric, shadow under the chin, and some lovely dry brush marks there. And we can add just a little bit of sepia with a tiny bit of light red. To the shadows on his legs. And there's one on the arm as well. And we'll put in sepia for the bottoms of his shoes. And a little bit of raw sienna for the tops of them. Now, the only other thing we need to add are the coffee cups and the tables. So with the cadmium red, just put in the coffee cups. And just start to fill in the tables and chairs. The tables I do first. We're just breaking it all down to make it much easier. So some cobalt blue and a tiny bit of light red. And now the raw sienna, which is quite a dark raw sienna, so we can mix that with some burnt umber for the chairs. Just put in the little bits that you can see. Oh, there's a flower pot here with some flowers. And this lady's got a handbag. Just a mix of Prussian blue and sepia. And we're really just filling up the shapes that are underneath the table. Okay, I need to let that dry completely now, and then I'll show you how to put the windows in the background. Right, now that's completely dry, we can put in the windows. Now you can make that really complicated, but they're not. It's really so easy. We're just going to start with wetting each of the window panes. I'm using the wash brush. I'll do 2 at a time because I really want them to look consistent with the colours that we're using in them. I'm just wetting right around the figures, not over the figures. You need a brush with a good point that will just take you up to the edges. Now that's very wet. I'm going to put in very, very thick paint, not mixed with water at all. That was intense violet. I'm now adding some sepia. And you're probably thinking, oh my goodness, what's happening? Right, some more intense violet. I'm trying to vary it so it does look like glass.